The latest from 7 News with Michael Usher.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight, new evacuation orders, major weather emergency as floods threaten Greater Sydney. Cleaning up in Brisbane, but more storms approach. We'll cross there. War intensifies in Ukraine, but where are Putin's tanks? Live to the key locations. And the final countdown, WA, opening up for long-awaited reunions. We're at Perth Airport. But let's begin with the weather emergency in Greater Sydney now. We'll take a live look at Camden in southwestern Sydney, where the Nepean River has been rapidly rising, moderate flooding occurring there right now, but the forecast ahead is not good overnight. The SES has issued an evacuation order for parts of the area. 8 areas in Greater Sydney facing evacuation orders. They're newly issued tonight. And around 200 schools were closed today. More are expected tomorrow. Let's go to Paul Kadak now, our reporter who's in Greater Sydney for us tonight, and the message for residents in a number of areas is pretty simple, Paul. Get out. What have you got there, the latest? Now, you're at Windsor Bridge, I understand, but the big concern obviously is the Warragamba Dam. It's been spilling since the early hours. What's the situation there?
Good evening, Michael. Well, there's a lot of concerns coming from all kinds of directions here. Yes, we're at the bridge over the Hawkesbury River here at Windsor. We're actually reporting here live for 7 News at 6 o'clock tonight, but we can't be in the same spot because that's now completely underwater. The river has probably come up 1.5 metres or more since then, and it just keeps on rising. Apart from the roar of the river, every now and then we hear this massive bang and crack as debris, whether it's equipment or trees, bang against the pylons. And across, this is the last link for this part of Sydney between both sides of the river. We're seeing a steady stream of state emergency service traffic getting to the other side with their flood rescue boats. It is this part of Sydney we've seen the first evacuation orders. That's at North Richmond, but it's actually not because of the rising river. It's because there's a dam nearby that could fail because of the sheer amount of rain that's fallen. They're worried that dam will completely collapse and completely wipe out that area. Those people have been told to get out now. But as you say, there have been more evacuation orders in the last hour or so, including Camden on the southwestern outskirts of Sydney. Part of Camden have been told to get out now. Parts of Chipping Norton, Milperra, Georges Hall, Lansvale and Moorebank, all areas around the Georges River and Liverpool, they've been told to get out by 3 a.m. We're in North Richmond a bit earlier where people were evacuating. We spoke to one lady, Faye, who with her daughters was getting her precious possessions loaded up. She didn't want to end up as one of those people who had to scramble onto their roof should the worst happen. Here's some of what she had to say.
A little bit upset because this has never happened before here. A couple of birds are upstairs high.
Right.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't reach upstairs. I don't think it will, but who knows?
It's been an ever-changing and dangerous situation throughout the day here. More than 80 mils of rain fell into 6 hours for some parts of Sydney. We were in Schofields in the northwestern suburbs where a childcare centre had to be evacuated by police. It had been cut off by floodwaters. They had to get the kids into a police van, get them through the floodwaters so they could be reunited with their parents. Pretty shocking. Very glad to be back in Mum and Dad's arms after that, Michael.
Yeah, that is good news there. But, Paul, floods are very recent in people's memories there. It was only a year ago along the Hawkesbury that there was a very considerable flood. And again, the Warragamba Dam at the centre of most of that. How does this one compare to last year?
Well, the headline from the Bureau this evening has been that the major flood levels will exceed that of March last year. So the message is if you were affected by floods in last year's floods, you need to evacuate now. It is the rain that is falling, probably heavier than they thought. And the Warragamba Dam has been spilling all day. Some 600 gigalitres has spilled out of that dam. To put that in context, that's more water than the entire population of Sydney uses in a year. And that's spilled out in one day. That is what is fueling that feeds into this river here, the Hawkesbury and the Nepean River also, as it drives up as the rain continues on. So they are very worried about what's to come. These people told to evacuate now before it's too late.
All right, there is a very, very tense night ahead there in that greater part of Sydney. Paul Kadak, thank you for that. Now to the emergency in northern New South Wales, and we've just been shared this bird's eye view of a rescue south of Ballina. Family of 5 huddled together on the roof of their waterlogged home. Now, Life Flight sent down a rescue basket. You can see that happening right there, and eventually hoisting them all up to safety. They tell us everyone, understandably, a bit shaken, but in good spirits tonight. Now, that is just one of the many operations that the crew was sent to. To Robert Ovadia now in Ballina on the New South Wales coast. Rob, good evening to you. Look, tragic news today that obviously the death toll is rising.
Yes, and sadly it was anticipated. It's not the sort of thing you really want to say out loud 2 days ago, but it was really inevitable when you've seen the amount of elderly people being rescued, being ferried out of the water along boats. You see the condition they're in, both here in Ballina and specifically in Lismore too, with all the rescues we've seen. You see they lack the physical capacity even to crawl out of the boat without assistance. So it was suspected very heavily a couple of days ago the death toll would be rising. We're seeing that today. It is expected to rise again in the coming days, and very sadly, Michael, the victims are suspected to be elderly people who really struggled to save themselves.
Oh, those poor people, Rob, who didn't get text messages, who wouldn't have received them, who just had no strength to get out from the ferocity of the flood to try and get on their roof. They had no chance, sadly, in some of those areas. And you're right, it is going to be the elderly, and the physically impaired who just couldn't get away from the floodwaters. But where you've been today, Rob, as we're seeing in some of the vision, 100 rescues, there'll be many more to come, but it's really getting into full swing now, isn't it?
Yes, it really is, and this place flooded a couple of nights ago and people thought that might be the worst of it, but there was a king tide on the way. That hit at 9:30 this morning and it was all hands on deck everywhere. West Ballina in particular copped the brunt of it, and we were told by one resident that very few houses remained dry in that part of the world. More than 100 rescues there. Again, many elderly people, but some who thought they could at least brave the flooding of their home, which was up to their knees in some parts, and just sit there and wait it out. There, of course, is a problem, and that is the sewerage in this part of the world. That was starting to affect people's morale and desire to stay in their own homes. So people who could have evacuated last night decided they would avail themselves of the services of the SES and police and even the army today to get themselves to higher ground and get themselves evacuated. God knows what they will be returning to, but a lot of people we've spoken with today expect they will be returning to a trashed house. The difference here, though, compared to Lismore at least, is that there is no apparent loss of life at this stage.
All right, Robert Ovadia there in Ballina, thank you. Georgie Chumbley is in Brisbane, where residents are counting the cost of all that major flooding. And Georgie, the Premier's warned that the state is not in the clear yet, with more intense rainfall on the way.
Good evening, Michael. That's right. Well, the concern is tomorrow. We could have some more severe storms late this evening, but tomorrow there could be flash flooding as well as severe winds, which the concern with that is there are trees and very wet soil, so we could see trees down across southeast Queensland. Now, we have had a massive clean-up already after the floods here, and the Mud Army 2.0 has gathered. We had 25,000 people in the 2011 floods volunteer. We're already up to 10,000 people volunteering to help out people who have been flood affected. And one such street and one such community is here in the suburb of Albion in Brisbane's inner north. You can see all of this stuff that's been flood affected and flooded piling up on the roads. And this is a scene repeated in suburbs across Brisbane. And we do know now that the cost of this could reach $1 billion. So the one thing that communities really don't want to hear is that there could be more rain and potential flooding on the way. So fingers crossed that we don't get that severe rain, but we are prepared and we're not out of the woods yet.
All right, and hopefully it's not an insurance nightmare ahead. Georgie Chumbley in Brisbane, thank you. Well, we're hours away from Western Australia reopening its border. Let's go live to Ben Downie at Perth Airport. Ben, good evening to you. A lot of people have been waiting a long time for this, so when do the first arrivals land?
Yeah, evening, Michael. They certainly have been waiting far too long, depending on who you ask. But across that 2-year period, there's been multiple times where the West has flirted with reopening. We even had a false start a month ago. But tonight, finally, just before midnight, around 11:20, the first flight international from Dubai, Emirates flight EK420, will arrive. 56 passengers on board that flight, the first of 4,800 expected to arrive tomorrow. Now, importantly, they will be the first that will not have to quarantine, ending that era of segregation, separation and exemptions. Across that 2 years, 50,000 people were granted exemptions to enter WA. 50,000 in 2 years. In 2 days, we've already had 8,000 people given leave to fly west. Michael?
And Ben, a rough idea of where are most of the travellers coming from?
Yeah, so around a quarter of them will be coming internationally. It's around 1,000 people tomorrow and around 1,200 come Friday, but the majority will be coming from interstate. There's 40 domestic flights scheduled to come into Perth tomorrow. Of those, around half of the people on board will actually be West Australians, according to our state's Tourism Council. West Aussies who've timed the end of their holidays to coincide with that border reopening date. But it will be getting much busier. Easter holidays and school holidays are on the way. And so what we're looking forward to now is the business improving for airlines and airports, but it will be quite some time before we return to those pre-pandemic levels of business. Michael?
All right, finally reopening. It's been a long time. Ben Downie there in an empty Perth airport for now, but about to get very busy. Thank you for that. Let's go over to Ukraine next. Our chief correspondent, Chris Reason's live from Kyiv tonight. Chris, good evening from here. What can you tell us about the new wave of the missile attacks and that news tonight, the significant Russian convoy that's approaching the capital?
Yeah, good evening to you, Michael. Look, Russia seems to be stepping up the severity and frequency of its attacks in the last 24 hours. There was a time when they were basically restraining their missile attacks, particularly to early morning and late evening. Well, now it just seems to be coming ad nauseum through day and night. We've seen, particularly in Ukraine's second biggest city of Kyiv, some vicious assault going on there. It continued again today. The police headquarters in some spectacular footage as the building just collapsed in front of the cameras. But also the Russian airborne are known to have landed on that city 3 o'clock this morning. The numbers increasing there. That is probably the city where they're making most advance. As you know, in the capital, Kyiv, they've been struggling because of the volunteer forces and the tenacity of the Ukrainian fighters who are basically keeping this force of Russians back, which has been quite extraordinary to watch. The Russians are making some gains in the south, some concerns there, but for now it looks as though they're holding it. And some good news on that tank front. We've been talking a lot about that in recent days. 64 kilometres of tanks, about as many tanks as would fill the distance from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, making its way down to the capital. It hasn't moved much, though, in the last 24 hours. They've hit some logistical problems, surprisingly. They've had fuel and food issues, not being able to feed the 15,000 estimated troops that are on board that convoy. So right now, the Russians bogged down.
Well, let's see what happens with that in the next few days. But, Chris, where you've been in and around Kyiv, you've had a close call and also evacuated.
Yeah, look, well, a close call. We just happened to be filming yesterday at a deserted freeway, 6 lanes, no cars except some wreckage of some Russian vehicles that have been tank bombed, basically, just sitting there on the side. And we noticed this missile fly through the air from right to left. It would have been about 50 metres above us. I've never seen anything quite like it. And the military escort that we privately hired to be with us has been in the military for some 15, 20 years, and he'd said he'd served in Afghanistan, Iraq, hadn't seen it either. A guided, Russia's version of a cruise missile going through the air. It hit its target about a kilometre away from us, the TV tower there. Didn't bring it down, but it knocked out TV transmissions throughout the country. Obviously, Russia trying to do its best to stop communications here in this nation. 5 people killed as well. And yes, we were not so much evacuated from the hotel, but evicted from the hotel, along with everybody else today. The clear out of Kyiv is quite significant right now. It's a scene happening across the city. We were with the UNHCR and also International Red Cross. All of us had to leave. The hotel wanted it cleared by 7 o'clock this morning because they're clearing the city out, Michael. These are tense times.
Extremely. Just, it might help our viewers, Chris. Just tell us, where are you now then and what's happening behind you?
Oh, look, this is fascinating. I mean, you go anywhere around, in fact, around Ukraine, but particularly in Kyiv, there are roadblocks like this everywhere. You can imagine your suburb, and at the main intersection of where your suburb might begin, they start sandbagging, bringing in concrete barriers and bricks and building what are rudimentary, basic defences against Russian tanks for when they finally get here. They're convinced that they're going to be the target of attack in the next 24 hours. They know that the Russians know where they are and they think that missiles will land here. I can't tell you exactly where. They've asked me not to, but they've dug trenches around the area as well. They're ready for a full-on assault. Now, these guys are all volunteers, Territorial Army. One that I just spoke to very briefly said he was the head of a construction firm. Here he is now, telling us to back off, so we'll come out of there. But he was telling me that he's a construction worker. He's put down his hammers and picked up his gun to basically come here and help out in the fight. He made an interesting point too. He said that Putin had made a determination. He thought he would take over Ukraine in 7 hours, and here we are 7 days later, and they still haven't taken any significant military victory. Right. So, and it's largely because of these guys. Their defence and their extraordinary work holding back Russian forces has been remarkable. How long that lasts, though, we just don't know.
No, he is an embodiment of the resistance that Ukraine's putting up at the moment, and behind you right now, more sandbags arriving to fortify that position as well, by the look of it. Chris, you've been evicted, you and your crew. Please stay safe. Go and find somewhere safe to stay tonight. I know you will, but thank you for that. We'll come back to you tomorrow. The US President's used his first State of the Union address to fire a warning shot at Russia's elite, the war in Ukraine, very much the focus of his speech.
We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We're coming for your ill-begotten gains.
Joe Biden announced Russian planes would be banned from US airspace and 60 million barrels of oil released from reserves. An emotional Ukraine ambassador that you can see there was in Congress for that address. A plane load of military equipment and medical supplies is right now on its way from Australia to Ukraine. The Air Force says a C-17 Globemaster carrying a non-lethal cargo left its Richmond base near Sydney today. Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced a $105 million package to provide defensive support and humanitarian assistance to that nation. Australian Misha Zielinski is a foreign policy and political warfare expert who lives in the Illawarra, south of Sydney, but he joins us tonight from Lviv. Misha, thank you very much for your time. Volodymyr Zelensky has become renowned, hasn't he, for stirring speeches and courage during this crisis. I mean, just how important are those public addresses for the Ukrainian forces and the people, of course?
Well, it's cometh the hour, cometh the man, and people may not know this, but he was a Jewish TV comic, come president, come wartime leader. And his speeches now are frankly quite Churchillian. If you watch him, addressing the European Union, addressing his people, doing, essentially selfie videos from the streets, saying he's not leaving Kyiv, he's fighting hard. One of the legendary quotes now will be, "I need weapons, I don't need a ride." When the Americans were encouraging him to move his government from Kyiv to Lviv, he defiantly stayed and rallied the people around him. And they're responding to it. So it's not just the military, it's ordinary Ukrainians are rallying to take up arms, fighting in the streets. I've seen vision, it's incredible vision coming through all across the country of Ukrainians not just fighting, but you've got old people, young people standing together, stopping tanks with their bodies and telling the Russians to go home. So it's extraordinary. And, you can't quite quantify it, but the leadership of Zelensky is absolutely rallying people to the cause. And it seems to have slowed down the Russian invasion, at least for now, mate. Yeah, so, I mean, has that taken Putin and his troops by surprise? And in your view, has Moscow's strategy seemed to change over the week? Or is it a case of just do not underestimate Vladimir Putin because he could still do anything? Well, we should never underestimate Vladimir Putin. He's clearly a man that's unhinged. Anyone who watched his speech Monday night a couple of weeks ago was a dark, dark, troubling speech we haven't seen really since the 30s in our history. So, it is worrying. Having said that, the expectation, Putin was selling a quick victory to his people. He thought he could knock over the Ukrainians, have control of Kyiv within the first 24 to 48 hours, have Zelensky marching down the street, get a puppet regime in place, and then dare the West to come and get him. Hasn't happened. And so now they've dug in for an actual war of attrition, and that is raising the costs on the Russian side. Now, there's no official estimates, but there are Ukrainian reports of thousands of Russian troops dead, hundreds of tanks destroyed, hundreds of helicopters destroyed. So there's significant costs on the Russians now, and the pressure's building on Putin. Sanctions are biting on him too, so he's under pressure at home, right? So the ruble has collapsed. Interest rates have doubled from 10% to 20%. 20%, imagine that, right? We've got nearly 0% in Australia. And so the economy there is cratering. He's under pressure from his oligarchs who can no longer travel around the world. They're being sanctioned. They can't get their money out. So these Russian billionaires that have stolen Russia's wealth, they're stuck in Vladimir's panic room nation with him. Yeah. And so they can't go to their French Riviera super yachts. They can't go to take their kids to their private schools in London. They're stuck in Russia, schools in Moscow, they might be all right, but they're not schools in London, and Crimea in the summertime is not quite the French Riviera.
That's a good point. But, Misha, also, I mean, Putin can control the message on his side of the border, but in the West and in Ukraine, he can't. And as you've said before, it's a smartphone war and everything is out there.
Absolutely. This is a smartphone war. In 1991, we saw the first television war with CNN covering the Gulf War. The extraordinary bit about the smartphone warfare going on here is that the Russians are losing it. So the Russians, have been experts of political warfare, of information warfare. But on this occasion, they're not the scrappy disruptor. They're the big aggressor, and they are struggling to control the narrative. The West and the Ukrainians really have largely won the battle for hearts and minds. Everything the world can do to rally to the Ukrainian cause is critical. The Russians are losing the battle, at least for now, but they are experts in trolling. They are experts in political warfare. We saw what they did in the 2016 US election, most famously, but they are really good at controlling the information space, and no doubt they'll rally along with their armies over the next weeks and days.
It is. I think Putin has underestimated the Ukrainian people and underestimated this whole new alliance of all sorts of Western nations as well. It's going to be fascinating. Misha Zelensky, really good to talk to you from the streets of Lviv. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys. Take safe.
Well, still to come, Australian tradies owed $14 million by a construction giant. The details from Melbourne. The economy's biggest recovery in 46 years. But what will war and floods do to that progress? The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, joins me soon. And back in business, what's next for the Queen after her COVID recovery? We'll go live to London. That's next here on The Latest from 7 News. Back shortly.